Hi, good afternoon and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, AI Policies and Use Within Organizations, presented by Saul Ewing, SpotDraft, and Brex. Today, our expert panelists will discuss the identification and management of risks that can arise from the employee use of AI, particularly generative AI, and the impacts that this new technology may have on intellectual property rights, data privacy, and more. I am Matt Cole, and I'm a partner in Saul Ewing's litigation group out of our Baltimore office. And I'm pleased to be here with my co-hosts, Tyler Finn, Head of Community and Growth at SpotDraft, and Alicia Nasimova, Director and Assistant General Counsel at Brex. But before we begin, there's just a few housekeeping announcements I'd like to make. First, we have a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and if you want to submit a question, feel free to do so. While we will do our best to answer all questions that are submitted during the webinar, if we run out of time, we will follow up individually via email. Also, today's program has been approved for one distance learning CLE credit in California, Delaware, Florida, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Virginia, with an application still pending in Arizona. As a CLE provider, we must be able to verify your attendance. Therefore, at random points during this webinar, we will display and verbally announce 3 numeric reporting codes that you must record and report back to us using the CLE survey that you received in your webinar reminder email and will open automatically in your browser at the completion of the program. We will in turn send you your certificate of attendance once we receive your survey response. Please be sure to respond to the Saul Ewing CLE survey with your numeric codes within 5 days of the program. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that will include links to the webinar recording, supplemental presentation materials, and CLE information. And the provision and receipt of the information in this program is not legal advice, does not create a lawyer-client relationship, and should not be acted on without seeking professional counsel who have been informed of the specific facts. And with all of that being said, let's begin and start the presentation with a couple of polls. So I'm going to pull up poll number 1, please. So poll number 1, very straightforward question. Does your organization allow employees to use generative AI tools? All right. So that's a pretty good ratio of yes to no. And well, we're going to talk about this in some detail, of course, but I want to start by saying that when I did a similar webinar in November, the yeses were in the 80% and the no's were in the 20%. Now I'm curious, if you could put up poll number 2, please. 2, does your organization have a written AI use policy? All right, so we got the opposite answer. So hopefully the delta of the 30% where your companies are actually using AI and don't have policies, that your employees are being careful. And Tyler and Alicia today are going to tell you how you can accomplish that, but also develop policies where you're in that 30% delta. So AI is here, right? It's everywhere. It's unavoidable, I think, at this point. And from my view, where I've been really focused on AI and intellectual property and data privacy issues for quite some time now. I feel like this really blew up last August when everybody got a ChatGPT account and was using it in every industry, in schools, for every purpose, and in all industries. So I think what a lot of companies are facing is that employees want to use AI. They find it as a great assistant, as a great way to take away some of the lighter tasks so they can devote themselves to some higher level and more critical thinking assignments, and they view it as a shortcut. And we're going to talk about today some best practices to make sure that your employees use it safely and responsibly and without and mitigating the risks to your company. All right, next slide, please. So just a little background on artificial intelligence before we get into some of the risk management considerations. Artificial intelligence has actually been around since the 1950s. and it is computer software that mimics human reasoning in a variety of different respects. So it's a computer software system that can be used to generate recommendations, draw conclusions, do large analysis of large data sets, make diagnoses, identify abnormalities, and make decisions. It's really widespread in many facets of our life. My 9-year-old uses her Alexa to wake up every morning with a different Taylor Swift song that is selected for her by her AI. But of course, it's in search engines, right? It's in deep fakes. That hit the news a lot recently with Taylor Swift. And you're going to start seeing, I think, a lot of this coming to the floor with the election coming up later this year. Google Translate, and I'm sure that Tyler and Lisa can give some color on this as well. There's a variety of different uses that AI is being employed within companies today.
Yeah, happy to jump in. I'm actually excited about that poll that shows that 65% of the audience doesn't have a policy yet. Maybe you have one in development, but that means that hopefully 75, 80 a year are going to walk away today and maybe be able to begin to draft and develop something. I do think that it's important to recognize one, the sort of like broader benefits that can come from the use of AI. I was just talking to the general counsel of a company that's using AI to develop genetic solutions to help fight cancer and other diseases the other day. So that would not have been possible as a business like 5 years ago or 10 years ago without the ability to use AI for the computations behind it. I'm not an expert on exactly how that works, but those sorts of solutions are amazing. You also have team members, right, across your organizations. Alyssa and I both work in orgs with a lot of engineers. Going to those software engineers or marketing folks and telling them that you're not going to allow them to automate away some of the basic sort of mundane tasks of their day-to-day, or the drafting of sort of routine code as opposed to things that are really using their intellectual horsepower. That's a hard conversation to have. And so there are certainly risks, and we will talk about those risks over the next few slides. But I think that it's important to start from a place of recognizing both sort of the broader benefits that the rise of AI and generative AI can bring to society, and also the benefits it can bring to sort of your colleagues and team members. Lisa, I don't know if you'd add anything there. You've been studying this for many years now.
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of it, right? Is the usage internally, and depending on the business that you're in the industry, you might have different usages for things like contract management or finding bugs, fraud detection as listed out here. But I think it's also important that the use of what we consider artificial intelligence or machine learning, kind of like 2.0 now with the LLMs, right, have been around for decades, right? When we have things up there like self-driving cars and Siri and Alexa, I think the search engines, it's been around for a while. I think what is given more kind of media coverage now is the LLMs, is those chatbots, right? Because now you get to kind of be creative and create different things with things like chatbots. So I think the underlying technology has been there. I think the new chatbots is what people are kind of considering to be artificial intelligence and not the underlying machine learning technology that's been around. So we'll be covering chatbots and LLMs as well as different uses depending on the industry.
And what that really means, I think, is that that AI can now be leveraged by a whole host of folks who otherwise would not have been able to access or use the technology. And that's not really my idea. There's a really interesting interview with the Microsoft CTO about this and the potential that he sees for LLMs combined with chatbots. It means that folks on your team who might not have deeply technical backgrounds can now use this sort of technology.
Next slide. Next. So before we jump in, let's just go over some basic terms that you may have all seen in the news or heard about, right? Generative AI, that's just a subset of AI that generates content. You put an input in and you get an output, right? It could be speech to text, text to text, text to images. You can create videos, right? People may remember the fake Drake when that came out last May. Generative pre-trained transformer, that's just the GPT. In ChatGPT, right, generative refers to the ability to make content. Pre-trained refers to the large amounts of data on which the systems are trained, and the transformer is the input sequence in results in some kind of output sequence. Large language model is what Tyler and Alicia were just describing. ChatGPT is a large language model, right? Billions and billions of tokens or text are fed into a machine to sort of produce some sort of predictive modeling. And when you put in an input, the system tries to predict, based on the language, what the output should be. And of course, it's a computer system, so it doesn't know language, it doesn't really have understanding, but needs to be able to provide output. And that's what natural language processing is, and natural language understanding. It looks at language in both a very formalistic approach, but since we're humans, right, and we speak in context, it needs to understand what we're saying. So if I were to say, hey, Siri, it's hot in here, crack the window, without that context, the AI system is not going to understand what I mean, right? And so we have to provide that. That's why books and poems and all kinds of comic books and everything is downloaded so that it can give the output that it predicts we want to receive. Hallucination is, you may have seen that term. So AI is prone to, especially Gen AI, of course, is prone to generating fictitious data, making things up, providing inaccurate information. Even if you write in your prompt, please identify all sources for me, it may still make up those sources. And so we're going to talk about today, one of the important points, my key takeaways is having a really well-developed human AI relationship, using it as an assistant, putting eyes on everything and verifying the accuracy of what you're given, especially if you are going to be sharing the content internally with colleagues or even externally with customers and clients. All right, next slide, please. So Gen AI, so we talked about this a little bit. We already described what a generative pre-trained transformer is, but it's really important to understand that the GPT isn't trained for accuracy, right? It's trained for fluency, and it's really a computer model, and we have to understand that it doesn't really know anything. And so we have to be on guard and set up best practices to review information for accuracy and understand that we can't use it to do math, right? It's really a language model. But you can do a whole host of tasks with it. I'm curious, Tyler and Alicia, sort of your view on how you're seeing it being used within organizations, including this list here and maybe other uses we haven't included.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. I mean, so I work for a company that offers contract lifecycle management software, and two of the ways that that sort of both that machine learning component, right, like being able to do analysis on large data sets and generative combined that we see in our product offering, and the offerings of a number of other folks out in the market as well, are around being able to do like data extraction, smart data extraction on very, very large data sets. That's the type of thing that you otherwise would have to pay humans to do, and it would take them a lot of time and would be very expensive. And as Matt's saying, and we're going to talk about this more, checking the outputs on those sort of things, especially depending on the context, right? Are you looking across all of your contracts just to sort of generally understand when things tend to come up for renewal during the year? Or are you extracting a piece of data across all your contracts for diligence during an M&A transaction where having an inaccurate extraction might actually be sort of material? Having the right level of human review, and I really like that phrase, human AI interaction is very important. I think that the other side that we're seeing a lot of use cases around is looking across either the playbooks or other contracts that you already have in the system and training a generative AI model to go and do some basic redlining for you or suggest clauses for you, and being able to do that in a way that is using a chatbot. So going in and typing a question and having it lead you to the section of a contract, and then doing the red line. Obviously, I'm in the contract management space, so those are a couple of the use cases. Our engineers are using ChatGPT models. On the marketing side, we're using this to a certain extent as well. I even use it myself. A big use case for me is I take notes from meetings and I put them into ChatGPT, as long as I don't think there's anything that's confidential in them or potentially sensitive. And I have it spit out key takeaways and do organization for me. A very sort of basic task that otherwise might take me 45 minutes or an hour can be done in about a minute and a half. So those are a few sort of both personal use cases and also use cases that we're seeing across the industry. Yeah, Alyssa, curious what you're seeing as well.
Yeah, so Brex provides corporate cards and spend management tooling. So we recently released our AI assistant for expenses and budgeting, which, like you mentioned, it suggests text that you would put into an expense report when you're submitting receipts, kind of, integrates if you want to with your Google Calendar, and will pull data extraction from that to say, hey, based on this time and this receipt, it was a dinner that you had with a client, and it would input the information you had from your Google Calendar. So, and then again, it would tell you to like check your work, make sure you're still checking the budget policy and all of that. So human intervention, I think, is the key takeaway when you're using things like data extraction and suggestions when it comes to these chatbots, right? Is making sure there isn't actual automated decision making. And I will always come from the privacy background of saying, automated decision making in and of itself is already against GDPR. So those rules still apply regardless of the new technology. So as we're waiting for new AI federal rules and regulations, it's important to follow what we already do have when it comes to data, right? So the data that's still involved here, whether it's PII or not, you shouldn't have automated decision making. So that's something that I would keep in mind as you're either developing or using these types of tools.
Yeah, I think one point to add too is that you'd be surprised, and I've been surprised from talking to in-house lawyers and HR managers at the different uses for which employees are using it, and that are different than sort of the primary business or how you think that they would be using it to do their tasks. And so that's why you need to have a well-rounded, sort of robust policy and not be so focused necessarily on my employees in R&D, so they're going to be using it to analyze patents and identify space. My employees in marketing, they're going to use it to develop some really pretty glossy marketing material. There are other uses that you wouldn't expect that are going to be using it for. And I will say that one of my use cases for ChatGPT is not developing slide decks for AI webinars. So I thought I would just put that out there at the beginning. Before we go to the next slide, I just want to read the first CLE code. It's 53213. And if you go to the next slide, please. All right, so here's some really interesting recent survey data, and it sort of tracks the polls that we saw at the beginning of this presentation. And interestingly, 80% of organizations believe that there is significant value that Gen AI brings to their business. So they are certainly in the majority of companies, and quite honestly, I bet you the AI use is even higher at those companies, including employees who are using Gen AI and ChatGPT and other tools on their private devices that maybe companies are kind of unaware of.
I think that's a great point, and it's not to say that it's right or in line with company policy, but I think that if you haven't gone out and worked perhaps with your CTO or your procurement team to think about how employees might want to use AI, solicited that, what tools do they want to leverage? Should you go and procure an enterprise license? I think it's highly likely that at least some team members are using a personal ChatGPT account in the absence of some sort of enterprise version. And so I think what we're here today to do is hopefully empower you to go and draft and roll out a policy, something that's going to be iterative because we don't have all the answers today, but recognizing that for better or for worse, it's tough to audit everything that someone does on their iPhone, and your employees may be using these technologies on their own if there aren't sort of avenues that are provided to them by the enterprise.
Next slide. So how are companies responding to the 80% that think there is significant value? Well, 27% of companies are actually temporarily banning the use of generative AI, and so in my conversations, I've found that that's actually a much smaller number. But I definitely trust the survey data. And so my biggest takeaways from this bullet point is that I think that's a no disrespect, a naive position, because as Tyler pointed out when he held his phone up in the air, someone's going to be using it somewhere, and you probably just don't know about it. So it's a best practice, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is put a written policy in place, get your subject matter experts around the table, and identify the risks that relate to your business, identify your risk tolerances, and figure out how you can manage this appropriately. Lisa, you have any further thoughts on sort of what you're seeing in the numbers here?
I think the numbers vary though, right? I've been at several conferences for Legal Week, AI and data privacy. And when this first came out, it was more of 50-50. Companies were saying, no, we're not going to allow for any usage of AI. And now we're down to at least 27% is what I'm seeing. I'm sure that's even lower now in terms of temporarily, right? I think
maybe her internet's going out a little bit. I mean, one other thing that I would add here, if you are going to sit in the camp of temporarily banning the use of something like ChatGPT, it's important to have executive team alignment around that. I've talked to one or two folks who lead legal departments, and they thought that they had gotten buy-in to sort of take a wait and see approach. And then they found out that their CTO or their head of product had gone out and procured an enterprise license, but had procured an enterprise license on their personal credit card for a small group, sort of a tag team of engineers to use GPT. So I would say if you are going to sit in the camp of we're not going to use this, we're not going to allow this across our employee base, it's very important that you actually get the rest of the exec team to fully buy in on that decision, and probably that there's going to be an end date. Okay, it's going to take us a quarter to align around a policy, develop a policy, we'll roll it out. At that point in time, we'll start opening up use cases across the org. Sorry, you got cut off a little there, Alyssa. You were talking about what you'd seen at different conferences and how that's evolved.
Oh yeah. I'd say probably last year the break was 50-50 and now we're down to 27%. And I think that number is even lower now. As you mentioned, there's teams or individuals that will be using AI either on their personal phones or trying to purchase with their own credit card because it's not something that's overly expensive. And at the same time, the vendors that people already have implemented might be using some sort of AI features that you're unaware of. So that's something to look for as well, right? A lot of these vendors have come out with AI features that are either automatically enabled and you need to opt out of it, or you kind of, if you don't opt out, then they assume that you've opted in.
Yeah, and I think that's, and your employees want to use AI, right? They view it not just as the shiny new toy, but as an assistant, as a shortcut, and as a time saver. And they are finding efficiencies. I mean, I'm finding efficiencies, in what I do. And so I think we just have, for the companies that are at the 27 that are banning it, I think the key word there is temporarily, because you're just fighting against the stream. Next slide, please. So how do we think about risk, right? That's what we're here to talk about today. And that's the key step, I think, before you can develop a robust policy, is identifying what are the risks to your business. And so there's a few ways of looking at it. And of course, right, the first bullet point is safety first, or just do no harm. And, from my perspective, being proactive is probably the most important mindset to take in this, because the risk of the technology is so powerful, and the risks are, vary, right, from intellectual property infringement or a data leak, right, a PII, regulatory risk. And so when you're looking at this, you have to look at it almost holistically. What are the risks, not just to an individual, but how they affect my business as a whole, and how do we sort of get out in front of it? Because it's an evolving technology, right? What people are using it for maybe 3 months ago, the use cases have changed, right? They've been refined, or they're finding new use cases for it. There are new tools coming on the market all the time, and it's being deployed widely within companies and among systems. So it has to really think about it as it's a risk management proposition, and not sort of deal with it after the fact when something does go wrong.
And this will be familiar to Alyssa too, from sort of the privacy context. There are different types of risks, and I think that that's really important as you think about being proactive. It's one thing for your software engineer to take your corporate code and put it into an LLM and perhaps create some security risk for the business, or to use ChatGPT to draft code and maybe, I'm not the intellectual property lawyer here, Matt, you're going to have more sophisticated views on this, but create challenges around intellectual property protections going forward. Alyssa mentioned automated decision making. If your HR team starts using AI and to inform what healthcare plans people are offered, or there could actually be like real human costs or challenges that are created. And so I think that, looking at this very proactively and recognizing that certain risks are more related, or use by certain teams are more related to business risks, intellectual property risks, regulatory risks, as opposed to other teams' use of AI could result in sort of real actual harms, is important for how you draft your policy, and also as we'll talk about how you message it across the organization.
Yeah, and to add on to that, right, think of the use cases for automated decision making, people using it for things like credit facilities or making sure that someone gets approved or disapproved. And if you're using AI for that, whether that be for analytics, for fraud purposes, right, and even for HR purposes, the risk of discrimination and bias would be the largest there. And the risk currently with this new technology in terms of LLMs and chatbots is the inadvertent risk when you're using that data, right? Unless you're constantly using it and testing it and then doing quality assurance and fixing things on your own internally, the bias and discrimination, it's not built for that, but it still does come about because it's still learning. So we need to constantly have that human intervention to make sure that the inputs we're feeding it are actually providing the outputs that we're expecting it, and then testing it. And then whether you can fine tune the models that you're using on an enterprise level, that's something that you can put into your contracts as well in terms of vendor data sharing and training on the models, is making sure that even if it's not training its own larger models, it could still train and fine tune the models it has exclusively for you on an enterprise level.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the three of us all agree on is that policy isn't just, set it right and forget it. It's got to evolve with your business, especially as the regulatory and the legal landscape is constantly changing and really picking up steam. I think last October, right before Halloween, October 30th, of course, right, the White House issued the executive order that was focused on setting standards for transparency, safety, and security. The EU AI Act is going to be voted on in just a few months over in Europe. They look at, a tiered approach based on the risk to the individual. And there are a number of states that have bills right now. Maryland, for instance, has a facial recognition statute that is being used. It looks at AI used in employment decision making. And then you have other bills that are sort of up for vote in the Congress. The data transparency statute that was proposed last December. So any policy you do develop has to also be mindful of the constantly changing landscape that is really picking up steam. And my feeling about this, and I'm sure Lisa, you have some thoughts too, is that this is in a way GDPR, right, 2.0, whereas Europe has this very comprehensive statute. The US is fragmented and sectoral, and we are, of course, playing catch up.
Yeah, and if you look at the different privacy state laws, they are now amending to include AI provisions within things like CCPA. I mean, Colorado came out one for insurance specifically, but it now has a provision for AI specifically in there as well. The SEC is coming out with AI provisions as well for broker-dealer issues. So it is a lot more kind of one-off and state by state when it comes to the US, and the EU kind of taking strides in terms of coming up with something that's more holistic. So it is GDPR, and GDPR, like I mentioned, is still in full force and effect for all the data that's being used here. So that is something you still want to follow, even when it comes to AI.
All right, next slide, please. So here's some other sort of more fine points on a risk analysis framework, some specific considerations for your team. And we'll talk about this, how it should really be a team, a steering committee, or just a team of subject matter experts from a variety of different functions. But here are some particular risks to consider when you're thinking about how to, what your AI policy should state, right? Data used to train the tool, right? So whose data is it? Right? Is it what open source scrape data across the internet? Is it aggregated data across different databases? Is it somebody else's data that you're licensing and you may not necessarily have a lot of transparency into what that is? Or is it a mix, right? Are you licensing someone else's model and you're fine tuning it with your own information? bias and discrimination. I think this has been touched on a little bit, but because humans are creating the training sets and the algorithms, bias is inherent. You've got to figure out, what use cases can sort of control for that, and how you deal with that, especially on the output side. If you are using it for health insurance reasons or employee reviews or other decision making that can affect an individual. And who are the intended users, right? Of course, you have your employees, but I think Alyssa mentioned vendors, right? Who has your data and how are they using it? And so you want to take careful control of that and understand that, especially if you want to go on site, do an audit, and make sure that how they're using your data in their AI programs sort of complies with your AI policy. Method of access, right? How can the employees that want to use it? For instance, do they have to get written approval from their manager? Who owns AI approvals? How are you documenting it? Are you putting it in a database somewhere? And what do you do if and when a regulator like the FTC does come calling and say, I want a record of how this employee was using it, or HIPAA, right? If there's a leak of PII, you want to make sure you have well documented record keeping, and a lot of policies require written authorization and written requests, so that's all maintained somewhere. And of course, governance and human intervention are 2 points we've touched on a lot. I'm going to focus on them, but it's really about ensuring checks and balances, making sure this is well thought out, and a policy should really complement sort of your other policies within your organization: cyber, data loss prevention, confidentiality, and of course consider what is the culture of our organization. Are we using AI that's the right fit for our business, and how we want our employees to act, and sort of the business objectives and our risk tolerance.
One helpful, at least I think it's helpful sometimes for messaging internally to different teams about why a policy is important, and why things like reviewing outputs and use cases is important. A helpful framework for thinking about this, I think, is thinking of generative AI as almost like an intern on the team. You would not allow an intern to develop a deck like this and then go and present it for CLE without reviewing the deck prior to the CLE submission and webinar. And it doesn't mean that the intern isn't going to do a really good job. It doesn't mean that the intern might actually have better grammar than you do, right? But it does mean that you're going to want to check and make sure that the intern got it right. And so I think that's a particularly helpful sort of corollary for messaging why thinking about these risks is important internally. AI is good at a lot of things, but AI doesn't have judgment.
Yeah, and hopefully my intern, or Tyler, your intern, or my junior associate will tell me that they don't know the answer to a question. You got to remember that Gen AI is not going to tell you it doesn't know. It's just going to try and slip one past the goalie.
Right.
That's why you've got to put eyes on everything. Right. Next slide, please. So here's more specific risk management considerations, and we put them in 3 big buckets. Risks to your organization, of course, your business operations, potential litigation, regulatory inquiries, if there's a data leak, or if people are using it and you get a cease and desist because their output might have someone else's copyrighted information in it. Risks to people, which is a very sensitive one, of course, right? You want to make sure that your employees' rights are respected, the rights of third parties are respected, and some ESG considerations. And I think the real important letter in the ESG for me is the S, the societal implications, because the rights of the individual are at risk, and you want to make sure that if you're using AI for decision making or even employment reviews, that you have policies that communicate to your employees that these are powerful technologies and they have to be well respected when they are used, and that the use cases have to be right, properly developed and right for your business as well, and consider sort of what are the effects on not just individuals within my company, but sort of outside and third parties and their rights as well. And that's where a lot of litigation is going, especially with the focus on transparencies and LLMs, testing for security, making sure you have all those cyber protections in place, because this can be, if something bad does happen, there hasn't been quote unquote a credit card breach yet, but the potential is there, and it can be much worse for individuals, especially with hackers, bad actors doing all the things that they want to do. So as an anecdote, right, one of the every year there's a hackers convention. I think it's in Las Vegas, and so my understanding is that the individual who won last year's hacker convention, he got ChatGPT to give him someone's credit card numbers. So people are getting better at using prompts to get access to training data and proprietary information. So, when using an LLM, you have to really be careful and study it and make sure that it's going to be used for the right purposes and they have all the protections in place, so it is not attacked. Right. Next slide. When we get into policy development, we're already halfway through the presentation. So here we are. You guys want to take the lead on this one?
Go ahead, Alyssa, and then I'll chime in with some sort of benchmarking that she and I were a part of a little working group that Matt shared a lot of great thoughts on as well to develop a sort of playbook around AI policy development. So she's in house. I'll let her kick this one off.
Yeah, and I think this always depends on how large your teams actually are and what the buy-in is from C-suite, right? In terms of what is the culture coming down from the top, saying that, yes, we're moving forward with this type of new technology, or no, we're just fully banning it and trying to control what we can and enforce those policies. So I think that needs to come and have executive buy-in, and then use what you have, right? If you're just starting off, look at the policies you already have for things like an acceptable use policy or confidentiality and disclosure internally policy that you can say, if you're using AI, this is how we're doing inputs and outputs. This is PII is not allowed, or it is allowed in certain cases. If it's anonymized, it's aggregated, right? There are certain things that you can utilize already if you're starting off. So I think start off small and then continue working on it. I think it's important to get stakeholders involved and having those cross-functional team members. There's always going to be an advocate that you least expect on a certain team, and it's good to just ask for volunteers, someone that is willing to actually jump in and someone that's willing to learn and be part of that sort of governance committee, right? And I'd say also include the naysayers, right? Because those are the people who are going to be pointing out the risk. And as in-house legal, we're usually the naysayers, and I try not to be for AI and new technology to promote product innovation within our teams. So I bring in someone in from, trust or cybersecurity. I bring in people from our compliance team because they will have those conversations with each other, and you kind of just be that project manager to not be the legal hammer. So it's important to get all of the team members involved, whether they are advocates or they're trying to say no to something, because there's going to be different types of mindsets and different ideas that are coming from different teams, especially from teams like finance and cybersecurity. So I think getting people involved, getting the executive buy-in, and then starting off small if you are limited on bandwidth and resourcing, right, is see what kind of policies you already have into place internally and externally when it comes to vendors as well.
I love that don't start from 0 point. And the one thing that I might add on there is that in addition to policies, you probably have processes internally that you can leverage to cover off on some of these risks. You might have a privacy review process for product functionality that's going to be released. It's going to leverage new types of data or new data sets. That's the perfect thing to begin to use as your product team or your engineers think about using AI in your own products. You probably have a procurement process in place for evaluating new vendors, new tools, or upsells, new features by those sorts of vendors, where I think we all agree some of the risk lies. I think it's important that legal doesn't get stuck as the one evaluating whether or not, say, a marketing tool AI functionality does what it says it does, right? Legal and privacy and compliance need to be thinking about, okay, what are the risks here? Not, is the product offering strong and is this worth our money? And so leveraging, say, existing sort of finance and procurement processes can also be really effective in my personal experience and what I'm hearing from the market.
Yeah, and that's your sort of to your point, Tyler. As you're developing a policy, you can do it in conjunction with demoing products, rolling them out, a phased approach. Right? It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be all employees. It can be certain employees within a certain function on specific use cases, getting them comfortable and demoing something for 3 months, and then having a wider deployment within your organization, and then tailoring your policy based on what you find works, doesn't work, and what your employees, what are their asks, whether they're must-haves, and what they would like to do going forward.
And I'd add to that, set metrics of what success actually looks like for a certain use case and a new tooling if you're trying to implement something new. Because I mean, I think we've all been through sales pitches where they offer you solving basically every problem that you might have in your company, and then it only does 20% of what it's supposed to. So having, sandbox environments to test that, having, a trial period where you can test whether it actually does what it's supposed to, and then actually making sure you have metrics internally. What does success look like for this type of tool before we actually agree to send all of our data to it?
Next slide. So here's some very, I think easy to understand policy considerations, but of course it should be clear and easy for employees to understand and follow. You don't want to make it too technical. You have to understand that this might be for your entire organization. So you have employees of various levels of sophistication. And that being said, you can have one sort of master AI policy and sub policies for specific functions or groups of employees or even use cases. Policy should of course be transparent, explain the risk, and reflect, company culture. I think for me, one of the big takeaways that I hope the audience understands is that there really is no one size fits all. The policy has to be sort of specific to your company, its culture, and its business. And of course, training and awareness is really important, right? You want to have these employees using a very powerful technology. We got to communicate to them, like, we're not here to stifle innovation. We're not here to replace you. We're just here to help you use AI in a very effective way, but here are the risks to be aware of.
We're going to get more into rollout in the coming slides, but I think that this caveat point about all your employees not necessarily understanding all the risks and maybe only seeing some of the benefits for them or their workday is an important one. I wouldn't start the conversation around an AI policy with the release and training on an AI policy. I would really try to start to do some software education perhaps before that, company all hands meetings or in individual team meetings, try to get folks aware of this and ready for it. So that way they're going to be more receptive ultimately when a policy comes out.
Yeah, and I'd add to that education piece, right, is making sure that people know what it is and what it does and what those risks actually are. I've seen where teams are split between they're just so excited to use it and they think it's going to help them become more efficient and do an hour's worth of work in 2 minutes versus people who are like, oh no, that's too risky and I don't want this, or it's going to replace me, so I'm not going to use it and make sure everything else is manual. So I think maybe a demo from someone internally or externally, even, law firms do that, right? Where they'll give you kind of like demos and we'll talk through the risk with your different teams of what is this? What should you actually be aware of? Things like inputs and outputs. Input injection is a huge risk that people don't consider, right? As you can have the same way you can have hackers kind of, duplicate an iframe. They can also input certain information that will make the chatbot give them confidential information that it wasn't built to do. So I think getting demos of what the tools do, making sure people understand how it works, and then what those risks actually are. So they have both sides of the story as we come out with a policy to say, here's how we're addressing usage and implementation, but also how we're going to try to mitigate risk.
In terms of mitigating risk, I just want to bring up one of the questions from one of the audience members. Kristen asks, do you generally advise that companies maintain a record of all inputs and outputs for Gen AI? That could be storage size prohibitive, so I'm wondering whether you've seen a more nuanced approach taken. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
And I'll start. I think it depends on the use case, what you're actually using it for, right? So different tools will offer you different things when it comes to storage and input and output logging. So there are ways that you can log all of those the same way you would log sessions and demos. I think the recommendation has always been to go for that enterprise level contract so that you can have that type of security and storage, because that is something that they offer versus, on an individual basis, signing up with your own credit card or having a small team using it. So I'd ask the tools what they actually offer, because a lot of them will offer some sort of encrypted storage for you.
And I've seen it where tools will save prompts, right, for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, what have you. But I've also seen some approach where maybe you're just rolling out a new tool or you're using a limited release within your company, just cutting and pasting the prompts into a spreadsheet and holding that in a database just so it's kept somewhere. and you can go back, and I think Lisa, you mentioned the point of developing metrics, right? Going back and sort of looking at how people were using it, what were the use cases, how are they using it? Is this the right tool for the task? Is this the right tool for the company? And those are two very, I think, key questions when you are developing an AI policy and you're in the process of developing it and sort of find the right tools to implement, which often go hand in hand. All right, next slide, please. All right, so here's more considerations. Now we're really getting into the nitty gritty, right? Who does it apply to, right? So of course we mentioned your employees, but you also have to be mindful of the third parties that have your data. In terms of AI use, right? What applications can be used? You know, what are the term T's and C's in the contracts you're signing up for, right? I think Tyler mentioned multiple times the importance of an enterprise solution and having those firewalls that protect your confidentiality, right? You don't want your employees, putting your trade secrets or putting medical records or some other sensitive data into a publicly available ChatGPT type tool, right? What are the use cases? And really, when communicating and developing a policy, what does it mean to your employees? How do they use it responsibly? How are they using it that fit their job in a way they can understand? Of course, compliance with laws and regulations, which are constantly changing, and that's just going to be a challenge. But if you have sort of a robust team of experts, your IS, your IS team, you have legal, you have HR, you can certainly meet your compliance obligations. And the last bullet point is kind of an interesting one. Right? Are there exceptions for specific employees and specific use cases? Right? Do you want to have your R&D team that is developing this neat product or this line extension? Do you want to give them some sort of special AI tool or just use it for a specific use case? And how do you train them? And how do you document all that? Curious what you guys are thinking of some other bullet points here.
I think a big one also is where do you go when you have questions, or if you think that a use case sits outside what's already been permitted, or if the policy explicitly calls out using AI around these categories of data requires additional review, where does that go? So I think you can't think of policy in the abstract. Policy has to be combined with sort of process as well. And so providing that sort of clarity on where do folks turn when they have questions or when they need, I hesitate to call it an escalation because I don't really think of it as an escalation at that point. But when someone needs additional review, who do they turn to and what's the process to follow?
Yeah, and I've done a combination of things when it comes to AI, because again, it does include data. And so data privacy here always plays a role, right? Whether you're using actual personal information or anonymized information, the inadvertent risk of someone's personal information ending up into an input or an output is still going to be there. And so including things that you would do for data privacy still should be involved, whether you have this policy or not, right? So if you have a new use case that's going to use data, I would recommend still doing an impact assessment, right? Making sure that it goes through the checks and balances of what you internally have for procedure in terms of data usage. And we do develop our own AI, so we do have an internal kind of ethical code of conduct for our engineers that are developing AI so that we can kind of mitigate the discrimination and bias that everyone's concerned about as well as we're developing. So we have a policy for development. We have a policy that we use as a general kind of here's the risk considerations and what we can or cannot do. And then we also have a policy for procurement as we're using external tools.
Yeah, and the AI policy should not really live in isolation, right? It should complement other existing policies, just cyber, your data loss prevention, and those should have clearly defined lines of communication of who to speak to if you have a question and sort of what to do if you feel like there's been a breach or something has gone wrong. Next slide, please. All right, so once you've got your policy in place, how do you roll it out? How do you implement it within your company? Tyler, I think you've already mentioned that you're interested in talking about this topic, so why don't you start us off here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is where tone starts to be really important and having an understanding of the culture of your business, where what your business's risk tolerance is, where you think the business is going to net out on use of AI tools or AI and products is really important because you need the rollout to be credible and you want to be trusted. Few ways that we've heard that of this going really well. Doing team specific trainings right? The way that engineers are going to be spoken to and the way that they're thinking about using AI is probably pretty different from the way that your sales and marketing orgs are thinking about this. And your HR team might not even know that this is happening, but maybe getting hit up by vendors and maybe coming to you saying, can we do this, right? So I think that the tone across different teams and also going and doing sort of team specific trainings that are tailored to the use cases that those teams are going to be facing is really important. I also would say that something that I've seen that's very effective is when you bring in champions from those orgs to either lead the training with you as a sort of subject matter expert sitting there, or for you to do it in tandem. So don't go and talk to your engineers in isolation, right? Have your CTO, have your directors of engineering there on a panel with you. Maybe they're the ones who actually go over the AI policy and you're just answering questions. That's a way that I've seen work really well for building trust, especially maybe when stakeholders are worried that a policy means you're putting the kibosh on using an AI tool, as opposed to thinking of it as something that's meant to sort of protect the business over the long run and also enable innovation. Those are just a couple of thoughts. Alyssa, what have you seen work well in your experience?
I love a phased approach, right? It gives you time to get that beta testing. It gives you time to get feedback, figure out what those metrics are and whether it's actually becoming successful or not. And it kind of helps you to figure out whether it's useful or not, whether people are adopting it. And so I always start out with the team that's brought it to me and is advocating for the business use case to say, okay, well, then your team is going to be doing beta testing before we start rolling it out. And then we figure out what the KPIs are and we see whether it's actually being successful. We gather that feedback and we put together a training, we put together an FAQ for people before we roll that out, and we make something available where we hold either like a live training or office hours that people can drop into and talk to you live about it before we have everything kind of be static and live on a page somewhere. So I think the phased approach is definitely the best because it gives you kind of that trial and error, and it's slower in terms of whether everything just goes out into Slack or something or an email, and then you get bombarded as the legal or compliance person. So I think having that phased approach, having more people learn as you're phasing it out so that you have other people that can answer those questions and it's not everything coming to the legal team.
I think maybe one of the tougher balances to strike as a part of this process or as a part of a rollout is both messaging that the policy is going to be iterative and we need to be in this together as an organization, and we're going to learn from you, stakeholders across the business, and evolve the policy without positioning yourself as we're going to approve lots and lots and lots of exceptions or entertain every exception that is brought to us to the policy. And that's again when I think that those relationships with other leaders in the business becomes really important, because they're the ones who can say, hey, look, there was this AI committee, they brought us in on it, we developed it together, we've told them we don't know all the use cases that are going to arise over the next 2 or 3 quarters. They're planning for the policy to be iterative, but you really need to follow this. And if you have a good question, you have a good exception, raise it, but this is the policy today. I think that piece is sometimes hard to strike, but maybe one of the more important parts of the rollout.
Yeah, especially I think one of the things to do is identify who are your champions, right? Who are your key messengers, who can relate to the department and speak their language, and get them on the same page with you so they understand what the purpose of the policy is, how it's to be used effectively, and that way everyone's on the same page, so to speak. Next slide, please. And so once you've got your policy in place and you've worked with your employees to understand how things are going to play out, let's talk about AI implementation and tool selection and some of the risks there. I mean, what are you getting? What are the T's and C's say? And I think, Lisa, you mentioned sort of a phased rollout. We've talked about demoing products as well. And who's going to own it, right? So where does legal fit in? Where does IS fit in? Where do you guys see sort of HR also fitting in this sort of framework?
I think it's the importance of having different stakeholders and some sort of, AI governance committee to review all of these terms and conditions when it comes to not just the contract, but the rollout and the use cases. When it comes to the contract, there's things you can include If it involves data, I include a DPA every single time. We have a trigger that if there's PII involved, Alyssa's involved. So I don't review the agreements unless there's some sort of data involved. And then my number one request is to get a DPA in there, right? There's things you can put into your actual terms and conditions about training the models. There's things you can put into regarding who owns the data, who owns the inputs and the outputs, right? You might own the input, but is the output owned by the tooling vendor or is it still owned by your company? So those types of things you can try to mitigate within the actual contract terms.
Next slide. And so what to do when something goes wrong? I think, I haven't seen a lot of this out there, but that's why AI policy is so important because the potential consequences of what to do when something goes wrong are significant. Right? You're going to have potentially regulatory inquiries, governmental inquiries. You might have reputational harm to your business and litigation. And so that's why you wanted to address it early and make sure that you have the right people in place who are part of forming the policy, speak the language, know what to do and sort of to mitigate damage. And that means, of course, your IS representatives or your CTO, potentially legal, HR, and have to understand so what is, what has gone wrong. Is it an external threat like a hacker who engaged in some kind of poisoning attack, or or maybe an employee who you're developing a model, they put some corrupt training data into your system because they're disgruntled for some reason, or was it you're just your sloppy employee, right? Who's you're working on really confidential product and project, and they wanted to take their meeting notes and put it into ChatGPT and have it turn the meeting notes into a slide deck like you've got here. So you have to sort of understand the risk, and the policy should explain sort of how to deal with those situations when they arise.
And I think this brings the importance of using what you already have, right? You don't need to start from scratch when it comes to these policies. If you have a data incident response or a security incident response plan and you want to have an appendix for AI tooling in there or AI development, that's a great start. I think AI is still evolving. The tools that we're seeing out there are still evolving and they're still trying to become more robust. So you don't need to start from scratch. If you don't have an incident response plan, that is something you need to start with for cybersecurity. But I think you can have something that's kind of like an appendix or an addendum to something that's already existing. Have your CTO and your security team involved in that, especially for things like simple audits, even for SOC 2 or PCI audits. That's something you need to have business continuity plans, incident response plans. And so if you have a section that for now, if you're starting off small, has, AI toolings that you already have implemented or planning on using, that's a great start.
We focused more on internal AI use policies today as opposed to public statements about how your business may be leveraging AI, and that's a whole other topic of conversation. But I think it flows nicely from here just to remember that you should probably think proactively about what customer communications might look like or what external communications might look like as you decide what your use policies look like, what different use cases you're approving, what different tools are being used across the org, right? Make all those decisions with a mind to what you think your talking points might be with a customer or a regulator or the press, in the event that you have to answer inquiries or you're just answering questions as a part of sort of the normal ongoing business.
Yeah, so I want to take, or almost at the top of the hour here, the end of the hour, I want to take a couple of questions that are in the Q&A. The first question is, can you point us to good examples of AI use policies? So my feeling about that is you can go on Google, you can go on LinkedIn, you could download a 2-page template policy, but that's really not going to be what your business is using. It might be a starting point, but it certainly should not be your end point. You have to tailor it to your business, how your people want to use it, the culture of your organization, and the use cases that you've identified that makes sense for your company. Curious to hear what Tyler, at least what your thoughts on that question.
Well, sure. I mean, I'll plug. We worked together on a playbook along with 10 other 15 other GCs, AGCs for privacy, leaders in the legal space on a playbook around AI policy development, because we thought the template was one piece, but it didn't really help you with the sort of nuanced decision making or the different paths that you might be able to avail yourself of depending on the risk orientation of your business. So that'll be included in supplemental materials for the presentation, and take a look at that. It might help you in drafting the policy, even if it's not a template policy.
And I'll just read the last CLE code before we break, 72935. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Are there any recommendations on setting the scope of an organization's AI governance framework that is all AI versus higher risk areas, and structuring evaluation of use cases to keep it manageable? So, I mean, look, I think here, right, baby steps. And one of the key takeaways for me is you don't have to do everything at once. But I think on the opposite end of the spectrum, like we said at the beginning, right, don't think that your employees aren't going to be using it, aren't going to want to use it. I think you have to, the first step is identifying what are the high risk uses, and are they the right, at this point in time, the right use cases for AI for your business. And maybe you'll get there in 6 months or 9 months, where the tools will develop and the legal framework will develop and you'll have other safeguards in place. But it doesn't have to necessarily be so binary, all versus none, or high risk versus low risk. I think you have to get comfortable with what works for your business and what your employees feel confident in handling. Well, I think that's it. I want to thank everyone for Tyler. You want to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I saw a question. There's only 2 CLE codes, so rest assured everyone will get their CLE.
There you go. I want to thank everyone for attending. Tyler and Lisa, thank you. This has been great. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Our contact information is in the slide deck.
Thank you so much for hosting this. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending.